Alright folks, I hope you can hear me well. This is Mr. Longacre, and I apologize for having to do some notes today through a film, but please make sure you're paying attention to these and you're listening because these are going to be on your test, which is 2 periods from now, and you will be responsible for this information even though I'm not going to get a chance to go over it in class. So today what we're looking at is Note C, so if you're not all there already, you want to make sure you turn to Note C and grab a pencil in order to fill out the things that we talk about here. And today our topics are about developed and developing countries. Now, a developed country is a country with a very high industrial base, meaning they have lots of industry, capital resources, which we'll talk about, factories, roads, and things like that. They have a very high GDP, which we know is gross domestic product. It's all the goods and the amount of money your country makes, so a very high GDP. But they typically have a lower growth rate, and that's because at some point, even developed countries begin to slow down in just how much progress they can make. And even though their growth rate is lower, they are still going to be at a much higher level than a developing country. So what you're looking at here is New York. That's an example. Here is another example here of South American city in Brazil of developed countries. So these are typically wealthier areas of the world and areas where you're going to see a lot of industry, a lot of money exchanging hands and things like that. On the other hand, we have developing countries. Developing countries typically have a very low industrial base. They are going to be mostly engaged in subsistence and commercial agriculture. Due to that fact, they probably also have a very low GDP. Again, they don't make much money as an entire country. But third, what's interesting here is that developing countries typically have higher growth rates. So since they are at the more bottom of the chart, they are growing faster. However, they are still very far behind many of the developed countries. So even though they have higher growth rates, they are still lower in terms of overall production and overall money making. The United States at one point was a developing country. And over time, as we started to pass certain standards, we became a developed country. So you're seeing a few examples of this here. You're going to see some more rundown buildings. Now, if you look in the background of this particular picture here, you're going to notice that not all of developing countries look like slums or look like ghettos or something that's very bad. There are parts of developing countries that can be very developed. However, as a whole, there's still going to have places to improve upon and things that they can do better. So we're going to now look at some of the characteristics between these developing and developing countries. And before we start here, just want to point out in blue, in the dark blue, where you're going to see some of the most developed countries in the world. Obviously here in the United States and Canada, but then most of Western Europe is going to be a part of that. And that is going to be a theme we're constantly going to see. We've been talking about how certain parts of the world are much wealthier for different reasons. And the dark blue certainly shows that here. I would add to that list the countries of Japan here and South Korea, as well as Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand. And all of these countries here on the eastern side of the world that are developed are going to have very close ties with the United States, and that's going to be part of the reason they have that. Now, countries that are somewhere in the middle, who are probably almost developed but not quite, are going to be found here in Eastern Europe and parts of Central Asia, with the biggest one being Russia. But then all of these orange and red countries are going to be places that are less and least developed. And you're going to see some of the worst places, some of the really troubled spots are going to be in Central Africa and Southern Africa. And so these countries here in the red and the green, they're going to have higher growth rates in terms of moving up, but they're very far behind in terms of total growth. And so keep these examples in mind. Now let's talk about some of the characteristics of them, okay? First off, our first characteristic is GDP per capita. What GDP per capita means is the total amount of goods and services your country produces divided by the people that live there. So in developed economies, the GDP per capita or per person is going to be very high. In the United States, that GDP per capita is somewhere around 50,000, 52,000. In developing economies, that number is going to be very low. So their GDP per capita is going to be very small. In some cases, it could be low as a couple $100. If you look on the chart here on the right, you'll see the top 10 economies in terms of GDP. Now, it doesn't show GDP per capita. We'd have to divide that by the total amount of people in that country. But you start to get an idea of some of the wealthiest countries in the world and where we might find those. Second is life expectancy. Okay, so in developed economies, because they have access to healthcare, because there is more money available to people, there's more infrastructure in hospitals and things, and other hospitals and things like that, their life expectancy is going to be very high. Okay, in the United States, we talked about this before. Life expectancy for a male is about 76, and life expectancy for a female is about 79. So that's very high compared to some other countries. Developing economies, their life expectancy is going to be very low. Third is population growth. In developed economies, okay, so in advanced countries, the population growth is low. This is because they already have a sustained, system that works and that has created growth, and therefore, once countries become more developed, their population growth is going to slow down. This is also due to more access to healthcare. Women's rights can be an important part of this. In developed economies, you're going to see more social rights for people, and usually the more rights people have, the smaller the families are. And so in developed economies, the growth rate will be low, but in developing economies, this is typically often very high. So in parts of Africa, that population growth might be as high as 4 or 5%. As compared to 1% in the United States. So that means there's a lot of people being added, a lot of people adding to the availability of resources, and so that's going to be the one that actually switches. All right. Here on this chart, I'd like for you to quick point this out. You notice in terms of what the population of the Earth was, in 1800 there were only 1 billion people in the world. And over time, as our technology and our industry has advanced, we've added almost, by 2048, we are going to be up to 9 billion people. And so you can imagine the stress that's putting not only on our environment, but on our available materials. We are growing very, very rapidly as a world. All right, our next statistic here for developing and developed countries is infant mortality rates. This is the number of babies that die per 1,000 births in a country. And in developed economies, if you can guess, this is going to be very low. In developing economies, that's going to be very high. So again, that has to do with healthcare availability and things like that. Literacy rate is our next piece here. In developed economies, the literacy rate is going to be very high, almost 99%. We can't quite say 100% because you can't put a label on everybody, but overall, in developed economies, you're going to see it at 99%, whereas the world average is only 84%. And so in developing countries, because of their lack of education, because of their lack of resources, their literacy rate is going to vary pretty greatly. All right, next is access to natural resources. In developed countries, these resources are going to be widely available and easily accessible. Specifically oil and coal and things that boomed the Industrial Revolution. Those are going to be readily available in developed economies, whereas in developing economies, for different reasons, maybe because of the climate or the soil quality, they are going to be limited at best. So natural resources include things that can be found in the ground, but also even just farmable land and water. In developing economies, because they are in a struggle with these, basic resources or natural resources, it's going to be hard to really focus on creating industry when you're simply trying to create food to supply your entire population. Next is capital resources. Guys, capital resources are any asset or any machine that a country owns that helps it create other products. For example, you see these trucks down here on the bottom. This is a capital resource because these trucks help construction workers create other products, whether it's a new building or a new bridge or something like that. Capital resources also have to do with factories. So factories that allow us to create manufactured goods and products that people buy in stores. the resources that allow us to create products are called capital resources. And in developed economies, there are going to be many of them. They're going to have tons of available infrastructure or capital resources like factories and trucks and money. Where in developing economies, part of the reason they're not going to have manufactured goods is because they won't have the capital resources they need to create them. So capital resources, again, if you want to write that down in your notes, is any asset that helps create a finished good or product. All right, next are skills of the human resources. Basically what we're talking about here are what skills do the people in these countries have? Are there a variety of skills? In developed economies, they are going to have a very high amount of skills, and they're going to be varied. So there's going to be many different types of jobs, many opportunities for people to make money and have jobs. Whereas in developing economies, again, because of the need to supply some basic needs, their skills are going to be relatively low, and their availability of jobs as a result is going to be low too. All right, one of our last ones here is standard of living. Standard of living is, the ability or the level at which you live at. In developed economies, because the GDP and GDP per capita is very high, the living standard is also going to be very high. And then in developing economies, that's going to be very low. You can see some examples here in this picture of developing economies, and really what it would mean to live in a situation like that, and how that would impact your living as compared to maybe something on this bottom picture that's more recognizable in our area. And just the immense advantage that people who live in developed economies and developed countries truly have over people in other places. We're very lucky to be where we live and have the things that we have. But there's different standards. So I come back to this picture. Here's one standard of living. Here's second standard of living. But then at the very top, certain people have an even higher standard of living, and what they deem normal and what they deem as acceptable. So, even in America, there's going to be different various levels of what our standard of living is. But these three pictures hopefully give you some idea of what that could be like. Finishing up, educational achievement in developing economies. A lot of their people are going to have a high level of educational achievement. If you look at this graph here, this is going to suggest that 85% of Americans have at least a high school diploma or GED. 37% of Americans are going to have at least 3 years of college, and 32% at least a bachelor's. 12% of Americans have a master's degree. And then only about 3% of Americans have a PhD or professional degree. So in developed economies, this is going to be, a familiar trend. In developing economies, all these numbers will be much lower. And then our final one for today, folks, is age distribution. We've looked at a little bit of charts on this before, but in developed economies, you're going to find that the age distribution, the amount of young people versus old people, is going to be about even. Whereas in developing economies, this is going to be very uneven. And when you have too many young persons, there are some problems with that in terms of them not providing as many resources as they're actually taking. The idea that if young people are working because they have to support themselves and they're not getting an education. And so some of these characteristics go hand in hand and relate to one another. If you look at this graph on the right-hand side, you're going to see an age distribution on social networks. And it's just kind of an interesting look at maybe what some of the certain demographics and people are involved in. You might find some of the applications that and you can kind of get an idea of that and see which ages are involved in which. But very important to have an equal age distribution and have different people at different times. So, all right, that is all for today. That's about 15 minutes. Please follow the rest of your directions in class. As I am not able to be there, and again, I only do this when we have to, so please make sure you've listened to all of this, you've filled out your notes, and you review some of the things that we talked about. All right, have a great day.